Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously fascinating linguistic mystery. Think of it as a true crime evolutionary story, but for our alphabet's lost letters. You know those 26 letters we use every single day? Well, they actually aren't the original lineup. We used to have a few extra siblings in there, these bizarre, beautiful characters that were slowly killed off over time by historical events, foreign invasions, and new technologies.
To get us started, I want you to think about something you've probably seen 100 times. Have you ever walked past one of those historically themed pubs with a sign that says, Ye Old Tavern? And you kind of wonder, why do we say ye? Well, spoiler alert, we don't. And they didn't either. That ye is actually a massive historical typo. It's just standing in for a completely forgotten letter that went extinct. So today, we're going to find out exactly how that happened.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our evolutionary roadmap for today, tracking the survival and ultimate death of these characters across 5 key eras. We'll start with a Latin constraint, move into runes and ligatures, demystify the phonetic rules, look at the Norman scribe influence, and end with a printing press.
Starting right off with Section 1, the Latin constraint, a clash of alphabets. The inciting incident of our story begins way back in the 7th century. This is when Christian missionaries arrived in England, and they brought the Latin script with them. But there was a huge problem. This imported alphabet was completely inadequate for what they needed it to do. It severely lacked the phonetic tools to capture the really unique, rich Germanic sounds of early spoken English. See, Latin had a standard set of 5 basic vowels and a pretty limited set of consonants. Now, that was perfectly fine for Roman-speaking Latin, but it completely failed to represent the complex pronunciations of the anglo-saxons. It was honestly like trying to play a grand piano on a plastic toy keyboard. There just weren't enough keys for all the sounds.
That brings us to Section 2, runes and ligatures, borrowing from the past.
Faced with this Latin limitation, early scribes had to get really creative to fix the problem. And they did that by looking backward. Enter our incredible lost cast of characters: Thorn, F, Win, Yog, Ash, and Ethel. What a lineup, right? To solve the Latin problem, scribes borrowed a few of these, like Thorn and Win, directly from the ancient Germanic Futhark runic alphabet. Remember, this was an alphabet originally designed to be carved into wood and stone. The Anglo-Saxons were essentially patching a software bug in Latin by importing ancient runic code just to represent the words they actually spoke. And when single runes weren't quite enough, these monks and scribes created ligatures. A ligature is basically just mashing 2 existing letters together to create one single character. For instance, they took an A and an E and squished them together to create ish. This was created specifically to represent the short ah sound that we use today in a word like cat or apple. Similarly, they created the letter Ethel by combining an O and an E for very specific long vowel sounds. It was a completely brilliant makeshift solution to make the imported alphabet work for their local language. Let's move to and see how this builds over time by tracking the unbelievable survival journey of the letter Win. It started out as the runic Win, which kind of looks a bit like a modern capital P. But over the centuries, as scribes tried to Latinize it, they began replacing it with the Latin U. Then, they started writing 2 U's right next to each other, literally a double U. And eventually, that ligature morphed directly into the modern letter W we use today. It is a perfect, seamless visual transition from the rigid, carved shape of an ancient rune into a flowing, calligraphic Latin letter.
Which brings us to Section 3, the phonetic rules, voiced versus voiceless.
Now, before we get to the mass extinctions of these letters, we have to demystify a quick technical distinction between voiceless and voiced phonemes. We had the letter Thorn, which technically represented the unvoiced dental fricative. Think of the breathy air-only th sound in words like thing or thunder. Then we had Eth, which was basically an altered Latin D. That represented the voiced dental fricative, the much harder th in words like this or feather, where you can actually feel your vocal cords vibrating. And that makes total sense, right? We have F and V to separate unvoiced and voiced sounds today. But here is the kicker. While they were technically distinct, scribes mostly just ignored the rules. Depending on whether a monastery was influenced by Roman or Irish traditions, writers often used Thorn and Eth completely interchangeably.
And that brings us to Section 4, the Norman scribe influence, the first extinction.
Unfortunately, this golden age of creative spelling couldn't last forever. A foreign conquest was about to trigger our first mass extinction event. If we track this chronologically on a timeline starting in the Middle Ages, we see that in 1066, the Norman conquest dramatically altered the entire trajectory of English spelling.
Because of this invasion, by the 1300s, characters like ash, yog, and win had virtually vanished from everyday use, and by 1476, the arrival of William Caxton's printing press would step in to finish off whatever was left.
The really crucial point here is how the French Norman scribes forcibly assimilated English spelling. When the French-speaking Normans took power, they brought their own scribes, and these guys had absolutely zero interest in learning a bunch of weird foreign English runes. So they systematically replaced those runic shapes with Latin combinations they were already comfortable with. For example, they completely changed the Old English quo to q, turning a word like quen into the modern queen. They also completely phased out the letter yog, which looked a little bit like a fancy number 3, replacing it with gh in words like knight. Why? Simply because they thought yog looked way too much like a z. They basically forced the original Germanic letters right out of the alphabet by imposing their own calligraphic Latin workarounds.
Now for Section 5, the printing press, the final blow. By the 15th century, surviving characters like Thorn were essentially on life support, right as a massive new technological standardization arrived to finally finish them off. This brings us to the famous story of William Caxton in 1476. Caxton imported the very first printing press to London from Flanders. But there was a massive problem as soon as it arrived, as he famously realized, even after all this expense, I'm not able to produce anything more than a crude imitation of the simplest English word. The continental typesets he bought from Europe simply didn't include a metal punch for the letter thorn. It just didn't exist in the French or German alphabets those presses were built for. So to print incredibly common words like the, Caxton pragmatically substituted thorn with the visually similar letter Y, hence, ye old tavern. That Y was never ever pronounced as a Y. It was literally always just a stand-in for the letter thorn.
But, we have to be historically accurate here. We can't blame this entirely on the printing press. The year 1400 is a perfect example of why. Well before Caxton's press ever even arrived in England, handwritten usage of thorn and eth had already been largely abandoned by writers. The written word was heavily shifting towards the digraph th anyway, mainly because it was more economical and much less susceptible to being misread. The printing press merely formalized and locked in an extinction that was already well underway. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate fate of our forgotten characters in a sort of linguistic graveyard. Thorn and F were entirely replaced by the digraph th. Win evolved into W. The ligature ash was split right back into A or E. And yug was chopped up into Y or GH. We didn't lose the spoken sounds themselves, we just replaced these highly unique single characters with Latin combinations that fit better into a standardized continental mold.
Which leaves us with a totally fascinating, provocative thought for today. The English alphabet wasn't just handed down to us perfectly formed. It was fought over, it was adapted, and it was changed by technology and conquest. With autocorrect, voice-to-text, and emojis fundamentally changing how we communicate and type right now, our alphabet is still a living, breathing, evolving thing. So I'll leave you with this. Looking at the keyboard in front of you, which of our current 26 letters do you think is going to go extinct next?